last event I'll be at this month, so you're not gonna have to hear the same thing every night. I'm just kidding. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone who came out last week for our very first Black History Month event for this February. We had so much fun. We thought we'd do it again, right, Jerry? There was if you don't know, we're live streaming all of these events this month. So you can watch them either live on our YouTube channel or you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel. So as of today, I think I heard that we have over 300 views of the event from last week. So we wanna keep that going. So make sure you share the link, tell your friends and neighbors. But I thank you for being here with us tonight, and I'm going to introduce Jerry Skotnicki and let him tell you a little bit more about the series for this month.
Thank you, Alan. I will be here every other session, so unfortunately for you. Again, welcome. I'm a member of the Friends of the Westfield Memorial Library, and we're a 100% volunteer organization. And what we do is we have events, we have programs that we fund or volunteer at to support the library and everything in the library. Many of these events and programs are shown or depicted on a flyer on the back table, but one such event is this, the Black History Month celebration. We're very happy with this. We always do this, but this one is a bit ambitious, more ambitious than we've ever done before. This program is being in partnership with the Dr. Martin Luther King Association of Westfield, the library itself, and of course the Friends. The foundation of this program is a collaboration with an organization called Americans Who Tell the Truth. This was brought to our attention by a long-term former member of the board, Alice Dillon. And so we'd like to congratulate her on that. And she continues to support Black History Month activities and always has. AWTT is a broad-based nonprofit organization formed by Robert Shutterly, an artist historian. He identifies numerous individuals, Americans, who are courageous enough to identify and address very specific issues, social issues, economic issues, racial issues, and he does so in the context of portraits, and you see some of the portraits around the room. He has created over 270 such portraits, and each of the portraits, you'll notice, has a slogan or has a statement that they've made, that the individuals have made. And in addition to that, there are narratives that he has provided. The narratives are available if you use the QR code, or if you want to get an abbreviated form of the narrative, it's in the booklet in the back of the room. The Black History Month celebration consists of really two parts. The first is a viewing of the art, and it's very impressive, very vivid art. The posters that we put out don't really do this justice. The second part are presentations. So we've identified 14 portraits that are models to courageous citizens. And these will be on display the whole month of February for your perusal. These portraits are paired or aligned with a variety of themed topics that are of each of our presentations throughout the month. And we're hoping that because we have significant local leaders to address these topics, that this would inspire really a vigorous discussion. And finally, I'd like to congratulate and thank the Black History Month Celebration Committee, because this is, again, a pretty competitive and in terms of intellectually competitive and complex program that we've put together. And I'd really like to thank them, all of them. For the individuals who are on the committee, please go to, the booklet in the back. They're listed on the first page. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dawn Nicole Manning to come up and say a few words and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jerry. Good evening, everyone. I am Dawn Nicole Manning, and I serve as one of the vice presidents of the Westville Martin Luther King Jr. Association. And it's been a pleasure working with Jerry and getting this project underway. As you can see, the portraits and everything, and just the overall presentation of getting this program together took great effort, and the results are excellent. And it is appreciated as an African-American woman celebrating Black History Month and seeing the efforts of others putting their energy into ensuring that Americans who tell the truth do just that is very important, because we know the times that we are living in, sometimes the truth is not told. But with this type of programming, it gives us all an awareness of what we are dealing with, have dealt with, for the purpose of knowing how to deal with things in the future should we have to face any of these trials, tribulations that we have already overcome. Keyword, overcome. We have already overcome so many things, and with that in mind, we have to continue to march on. We have to continue to stand hand in hand and continue to do the work that we know that's going to put forth justice for all, not just one group, but for all. Can I get an amen on that one? All right. Okay. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Brother Rob Tuck. I had the pleasure of working with him at Rahway Academy. He is one of the paraprofessionals there. He is such a phenomenal person. I just have to brag on him. He did receive the Governor's Award as ESP of the Year. So we are being blessed on this evening, yes, with someone who has rich history and knowledge. And I look at him as living history, because the stories that he shares and just the information, he's been so busy during the course of this month because he's been called out so many times. When Jerry asked if there would be someone that I could recommend, and when I called upon him, he said yes without hesitation. So I'm very glad that he is here to share with us on tonight, and I hope that you receive him with open ears to, once again, go forth with what? Americans telling the truth. Thank you, Rob. Your turn now.
That was so nice. That was so nice. That was beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Manning. Well, I did get the teacher award. There's an old saying that says, those who hear the cries of children, God will bless. That's what they say. This topic, let me start here, because it is actually a gargantuan task, because when we speak of the African American impact on sports and entertainment, and what I did was I followed up from last week. Professor Alcott, what a masterful job he did. He had the PowerPoint and everything. So mine is a little bit, pardon my primitive setup here, but I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood. But I want to, we're going to start out here, the impact of sports and entertainment on African American impact. So, because it's so vast, I tried to make an outline, fill in some gaps. Pardon me if I have to remember something and go back, but I'm going to try to create a timeline, because, and then as I go, you'll see why I say this, because there's so many dynamics and nuances to it. It's not cut and dry as one would think. Let's just start out with some of the earliest notable African American athletes in America. The African American presence in sports during the early 1900s. I want to start there and work our way up just to give us some type of substance. Since I don't have a PowerPoint, I'll mention the little subtitles. But some of the, and then I came up with early African Americans that would medal in the Olympics. And we would find that one of the first, and I've created some cue cards here, goes back to 1902. And I think we're so accustomed to hearing our, modern day Olympic guys, but there was a gentleman, George Poage, if anybody's familiar. He actually won 2 bronze medals in 1904 in St. Louis. And I hadn't heard of him until we started digging. He did that in the 200 and 400 meters. One of the earliest football athletes was a Charles Folis, first football player, 1902. So we're talking just not too long after slavery ended. So we were starting to move on up and move, you know, these guys were spreading out. Then we had John Baxter Taylor. These are just some of the notable names. We won't, you know, he was the first to win a gold in 1908 in the Summer Olympics in London. And then, you know, there were several African Americans that won Olympic medals throughout those early years. We had the 1902, 08, 12. But of course, we're going to jump to one of the most notable, Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens won the 4 gold medals in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And we all know the story, how they say Hitler didn't shake his hand when he came back. Jesse, you know, he couldn't ride on buses and this and that. But one other thing that needs to be noted, there were 9 other African Americans that won medals during the 1936 Olympics. So these were kind of hidden gems that we don't hear on the mainstream. So covering, you know, starting in the early 1900s in Jesse Owens, and you know, like I said, there were 14 other total medals that were in the 1936 Olympics. Then, you know, I'm trying to name some of the most notable that we may have heard of. Jack Johnson, 1908, first African American heavyweight champion. Excuse me. Now, throughout this, pardon me and work with me, sometime I may say black or African American, it's just semantics, the same thing. So Jack Johnson, first black heavyweight champion. Jack Johnson was a very charismatic fighter, made lots of money. He had a lot of endorsements. We're talking 1908. Jack Johnson was very bold. He married white women. He smiled in defiance at the white crowds, and there was a lot of race riots during his time. Jack Johnson was into fancy clothes, fast cars. In fact, there was a story, Jack Johnson was traveling 100 miles an hour on a highway in North Carolina. He got pulled over by the cops. They said it's a $50 ticket. He gave the cops $100. He said, because I'm gonna be coming back the same way on the way back. So this, now that tells you the boldness of Jack Johnson. He's telling a white police officer in the South this. So he actually was arrested, if you hadn't heard during history, by what they called the Mann Act for transporting his wife, a white woman, across state lines. He was eventually exiled out of the country. So these were some of the ostracized things that happened to the athletes. Jack Johnson. The black athletes carried the burdens of race with them during these early times. We're talking maybe 50 years after slavery. So imagine how bold and charismatic and no fear. But one thing after that, as we move up, the Negro Baseball League, how impactful that was during the 1920s. Rube Walker, these were businessmen. And the thing about the Negro Baseball League, they used to play the major leagues and all-star games and beat them. And they had some of the greatest athletes, Satchel Paige. Josh Gibson was an interesting name, Negro League Baseball. He was said to have hit 800 home runs. So he did this before the stories of Babe Ruth and at those times. So then, of course, one of the most popular, Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson, of course, our first African-American to play in the major leagues, 1947, won a championship in 55. But things about Jackie Robinson, besides his baseball exploits, when he retired, Jackie Robinson helped form the first black-owned bank, First National Bank in New York. He He also had a construction company, Robinson Construction, where he built affordable homes. So besides his baseball exploits, Jackie Robinson really was a force of nature. One thing, tragedy he had in his life, he had a son, Jackie Robinson Jr., that was a heroin addict. And he had gotten clean over the years, but it broke Jackie's heart. Then when his son was 24, he died tragically in a car accident, and that really tore Jackie up. Jackie Robinson was a diabetic. He just gave up on health, and he actually passed away at 52 years old. A lot of people don't realize he was that young. And his wife, Rachel Robinson, is still with us to this day. She's 101. Rachel Robinson, yeah.
102.
102, thank you. You know, see, we can interact here, so it's not one-sided. This is,
My
this,
husband knows her personally.
oh, that's sweet. Yes, yes. And this is a conversation, so, you know, don't look at me as I'm up here with you know. Also, why I say this is a gargantuan task to do this, because the psyche of the African American or the black changed from the 1800s, and I started in the early 1900s, but we'll get into the psychological dynamics, because then we had the Great Migration. Up until 1910, 90% of black people lived in the South, 90%. So the Great Migration started in the early, you know, maybe the 1920s, where 6 million blacks left the Jim Crow South for jobs, the diabolical treatment they got. You could be hung or, you know, lynched or killed. So they looked for work. So one of the things, and it's this lady, and you know, maybe after the thing you can look, if you haven't heard this book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. She chronicled some interviews of actual people that they're elderly folks now, but she chronicled and interviewed them, their journey north. And the connection and the relationship of black folks as they came, they didn't even know each other, but they had one thing in common: escaping the South, Jim Crow laws. And when they came here, she speaks of one situation where a gentleman got on a train from Florida. He got up to Harlem, because these were the cities that were flooding with blacks. And he had lost his sister's number, so he didn't have anywhere to go. He's in this big city coming from a rural South, and some black folks took him in. They were like, you know, we got you until you can remember the address. So this, this makes me think of Dr. Cornel West referred to these people coming from the South that endured this as love warriors. I mean, think of that title. You're coming from all these atrocities and these burdens and death and the fear, and you still can persevere. And so Love Warriors is a great title. But so the Great Migration, they filled up these cities: Detroit, Harlem, Chicago. Chicago was a big one. And so speaking of Harlem, then we had what they called the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was that is when we had great literary figures: Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. She had come up, all of these people together, or James Baldwin later on, the great master teacher John Henrik Clarke. So the thinking of the African American changed. I think perhaps in the early 1900s, even the athletes might have been a little bit more servile. Now you're becoming more conscious, so to speak. The poems of Langston Hughes, where the one he says, his mother to the son, life is no crystal stair. If you haven't heard that, look that up, where she's saying life is no crystal stair. Everything is tough out here. She's preparing her son for the world. Then, you know, we spoke of Jackie Robinson coming up. I jumped to the 1950s, and that is where we had the bebop era. We talk about the impact, the musicians that come out of that area. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie. not to mention, I got ahead of Duke Ellington and Count Basie, some of the greatest composers that ever walked the face of the earth. Count Basie, New Jersey's own here, Red Bank. But speaking of Charlie Parker was like the Michael Jordan of jazz. Jazz, up until that point, was sort of melodic or ballad. Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie sort of accentuated the notes. So, they went from ba-da-da-da jazz to ba-ba-ba-da. So they created a whole genre. And it was just pure genius. You know you're a trailblazer when your peers will knock over anything to go see you. When Charlie Parker came to New York, it was like Parker's in town. And these are other great jazz musicians. So he had revolutionized jazz, and he was a sax player. Sadly, Charlie Parker became a heroin addict. He passed away, he was only 34 years old. 1955. Still today, there are jazz musicians who cannot replicate what he has done musically, the way he played, his speed. And so we talk about the impact of music, in here. I skipped over the great Louis Armstrong, who, revolutionized jazz, one of the originators, at the bottom, New Orleans native. Of course, the great Billie Holiday. Now, important to note, the African Americans that came from the South flooded the city. Chicago was one of the main cities where African Americans went. So we had chess records in the birth of the blues. We had some names you might be familiar with: Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. Even some of the jazz musicians were natural, at playing the blues. Matter of fact, Miles Davis, the great trumpeter, was once asked, he said, an interviewer asked him, he said, you can play the blues. Did you have a tough life? He said, my daddy's rich and my mama's good looking. His father was a dentist. People don't realize Miles lived an affluent life. He had an affluent background, from the St. Louis area in Chicago. But these guys that were giants, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, and Chicago was really vibrant. These cities, Harlem, Chicago, Los Angeles, this is where 6 million blacks, so it changed the whole landscape of the nation. Also, getting back into the literaries that started the flood, it sort of changed the mindset. Like I said, black folks started to become conscious. And you had, like I mentioned, some of the master teachers, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Jochannan, they introduced Black America, who thought their history began with slavery. Now he opened it up to the continental Africans. He spoke of leaders there. They spoke about Kemet, or Egypt. And so blacks started to identify that lineage, and it empowered them. You had historians that talked about the pyramids in Egypt, and they would say that the Egyptians, they weren't black. So Cheikh Anta Diop, and I was speaking to the gentleman from Senegal over there, Cheikh Anta Diop was a forensic scientist, and he did a forensic test on the mummies showing they were heavily melanated. So this awakened the blacks here in America, so the whole psychological dynamics changed. Now we were talking about empowerment. So by the time they came up to the 60s, that was the turbulent 60s, that became an explosion. Black people now became empowered. We'll get to the Black Power movement, but we must first mention this was the time of one of our portraits, Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali. Started out as Cassius Clay, very, very flamboyant and determined, and mainstream would call cocky. He later had said he was marketing, to get fights. Then he had adopted, became a Muslim, and he became the great Muhammad Ali, one of the most recognized names ever, an ambassador to the world. But speaking of him joining the Nation of Islam, he was under the tutelage of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So for mainstream who didn't have an understanding of Islam, it seemed kind of revolutionary to them. It was in the sense of change. When we think of revolution, we think of violence or fighting, but it's just change. So the Nation of Islam came to the United, even though it's an ancient religion, came to the United States in 1930. Honorable Elijah Muhammad started it here, started in Detroit, New York. But what they did was they believed in self-reliance. And so they created buildings, their own temples. So it really wasn't anything against the system. It was just a do for self. They grew their own food. And I will say this, I will say the Nation of Islam probably cleaned up more grassroots black males on the street that might have been on drugs than most entities ever in the United States. So we got to look at truths, and we got to look at alternative truths as well. So Muhammad Ali, being a Muslim, of course. Oh yes, ma'am.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah, we can interject. Yes.
You mentioned that Islam came to the U.S. in the 30s, but people have to understand that those who were kidnapped and brought across the Atlantic were Muslim.
Absolutely.
They were
Yes.
Muslim when they got here.
Yes, yes. Well, there's another book, and keep in mind we can interject. I'm just because we're having conversation. There's also a book called "The Destruction of the Black Civilization" by Chancellor Williams, and he talks about the invasions from the East, the Arabs, and so early on the Berbers introduced Islam to a lot of the nations, Western, Ghana, Mali. They're still Islamic nations now. But yes, no, it goes back hundreds of years. But for the United States, yeah, it was early on. And now I don't want to, get too far into the whole Islamic thing. The version is a little different than the global thing. But these professors during this Harlem Renaissance and stuff, like I said, Dr. John Henrik Clarke, Dr. Ben, they introduced a more global perspective on blackness and being African American. Now, before you were Negro, now you were African American or black. It's interchangeable. They still take pride in saying black folk. It's nothing derogatory. But now they had an identification to the continental African. And so now we had people that were now Pan-Africanists. And so that means, like I see my dear brother back there, Professor Walcott, being Barbadian, so me as an African American, he is my Barbadian brother. There is a universal connection that doesn't exclude anyone else, but it's kind of a spiritual innateness that Pan-Africanism brings. You may not even see a person in your life, but for the Pan-African mindset, it's like, there's a connection, because none of the slave ships came directly from the west coast of Africa to the U.S. Of course, they dropped off. So the division is kind of evaporated when you have the Pan-African sort of mindset. But so we got off on the thing about the Nation of Islam, which led up to, of course, we're familiar with Muhammad Ali's defiance to go to Vietnam. Now, mainstream would say he was a draft dodger or whatever, but the alternative truth is he was a conscientious objector. I mean, in interviews, he said, and pardon the grammar, I ain't got nothing against the Viet Cong. He said, you my enemy right here. So we got to look at, we're Americans telling the truth. So there's a truth and there's an alternative truth. So he went to the 1960 Olympics, won a gold medal, came home, couldn't go in restaurants. And it's written where he threw his gold medal in the Ohio River out of anger. And so when he was defiant, you know, he was disbarred from boxing. He couldn't box for a few years. And I said, this is all under the tutelage of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Now all of a sudden, Muhammad Ali spoke intellectually, and he was a Southern boy from Louisville. He still had that Southern drawl, but now he was infused with this black brilliance. So that's why this is kind of a gargantuan task, because we got to speak on the psychodynamics that change with the Great Migrations. You know, like I said, 90% of blacks were in the South before 1910. Now you got blacks filling these cities, and now you got all kind of professors, all kind of schools of thought. And let me see who we mentioned here. Like I said, we mentioned the great teachers. Like John Henry Clark was one of the masters, because he's one of the main ones that taught the blacks here that you had a history thousands of years before slavery. And so now this opened up a whole new mindset and intellect here. Regarding the 60s, and we talk about Muhammad Ali, very outspoken. He was very defiant, very bold and brash. And this once you learn something, it changes your life forever. And all of a sudden now, he had a confidence where he had no fear. So when he got disbarred, it really didn't challenge him. He helped people. There was one incident where a guy was gonna jump off a building in Chicago. They go get Muhammad Ali, talks the guy down and pays the guy's rent for like a year. The guy couldn't get an apartment, he was distraught. So these are some of the things that we had. So the turbulent 60s brought, we talk about music, the influence. Well, let me go back. Well, no, let's stay here. Motown. Everybody's familiar with Motown. We're talking about a lineup of the Temptations, the Martha and the Vandellas, Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, one of the greatest songwriters ever. You know, all of these songs, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, all the Motown songs, Ashford and Simpson, they were publishers, Nick Ashford, Valerie Simpson. So the Motown sound kind of just blazed through the 60s. It became movie soundtracks. It changed the course of life in black homes. You heard it glaring at cookouts, and black folks were a family, essentially, during that time. I'm a child of the 60s myself, so I can remember a lot of cookouts. There was a lot of black love. So, you know, growing up in a black community back then, you felt the closeness. Playgrounds were full of children. It's a little different now. We got social media, kids aren't going out as much. But this Motown thing, Barry Gordy, the founder, created you just can't say enough about Motown. It was black music, but it was universal, because it went everywhere. Motown was such a giant, we forget about Stax Records down in Memphis. We had Otis Redding, the Bar-Kays, the Staple Singers. So these were all Isaac Hayes. These were all just powerful giants of music that came on the scene, and blackness became an essence. It's not just melanin. It's a beautiful essence that people, internalize. And so the 60s were that. Also, in sports, we mentioned Muhammad Ali. We had a few firsts back then, players that played football, baseball. We mentioned Jackie Robinson. But the 60s, of course, we think of the turbulent 60s as the political landscape, but blacks were involved in politics. We had Malcolm X and Dr. King. Dr. King, he led the boycotts and stuff. Now, one thing we'll talk about, Dr. King, he led the marches, the We Shall Overcome, but toward the end, with all of the things going on, Dr. King started to become more revolutionary. If you listen to his last speech before he passed away or assassinated, he mentioned about black people taking their money out of banks, putting it in black banks. Go back to that I've been to the mountaintop speech, and you'll hear that. He talked about, boycotting, naming companies. Coca-Cola, of course, spoke out against the Vietnam War, and these were no-nos for the powers that be. It's a little known fact as well, Dr. King stayed on the west side of Chicago during the '68 Democratic elections. He marched with gang members, the vice lords, because there was a gentleman out there, Fred Hampton, who was leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. We'll talk about the Black Panther Party. But he was bringing gang members together to vote. They were getting more articulate. They were feeding their minds. And of course, we had the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO, who started to infiltrate and bring in outsiders to spy on the. But Fred Hampton was an extremely charismatic 21-year-old law student. That's one thing about the Black Panthers. They weren't thugs. The Black Panthers were formed in 1968. Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale. They had a young gentleman, Little Bobby Hutton, 17 years old, out in Oakland. These guys, they had free breakfast, free health care clinics. A lot of people don't realize that. They weren't just out here thugging in the streets. Little Bobby Hutton was the first Panther murdered by police. And just to show you how well respected the Panthers were, because they were articulate. They were getting political. They weren't just out, and they were against police brutality because a lot of blacks were being stopped and killed. And so Little Bobby Hutton, when he was murdered, Marlon Brando eulogized him at his funeral. So just think, Marlon Brando, this iconic actor, eulogizing a Black Panther, a 17-year-old. So you had, the Panthers were getting money from white politicians, and because of their message, but of course they got the rap, about being violent and bravado, and but they were actually law students. They formed on University of California, Berkeley. That's where they started, in Oakland. And Huey, you can even look at the surviving Panthers. They're all scholars. Angela Davis is a professor at University of California, Santa Cruz, if she hasn't retired. Bobby Rush was congressman in Chicago. Jamal Joseph is a professor at Columbia University. So these were high-level thinkers. Huey P. Newton had a PhD, and most of the professors are PhDs. So you had this Black Power movement. You had the Panthers, the Nation of Islam. So the 1960s was just on fire. It was an explosion of thought. But the black intellectuals, like I said, they identified with Africa. They identified with a global blackness. They had a Pan-African mindset. And so you had these intellectuals that were now changing the course of thinking. They wanted to defy the myths of black inferiority. That was the basis. So we can go to, of course, Malcolm X was a big name, extremely articulate, incredibly intelligent. The FBI, they spied on him, and in one of the tapes they said they couldn't find anything. They said this guy's a saint. So he was real disciplined to the movement. And, of course, you had Elijah Muhammad. Let me see. I'll mention Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory, of course, you saw in the book there, he started out as a track star in school. And then he became, he got into politics, he ran nightclubs, very charismatic. Dick Gregory had to be a beautiful mind, because his level of intelligence and wisdom was just bar none. I want to share a book he wrote in 1967, very profound. You can see the title. And he told his mother, every time you hear that word, think of my book. because he grew up in St. Louis under a lot of racial hatred. He was always a hustler. Even when he was a child, he sold newspapers, he shined shoes, and he had one incident where he went in a bar. One of his clients, an older white guy, he went to get him in the bar, and another white man kicked him in the face. So when things like this happen, it sort of shapes your mind. So later on in life, Dick Gregory, when he did his comedy, did a lot of black and white racial satire, and these are some of the things that stays with you. Brilliant man, Dick Gregory. Let's see.
You mentioned about
Please.
Fred Hampton.
Oh,
the movie
yeah.
Judas and
Yeah,
the Black
yeah,
Messiah.
yeah.
Excellent. You see how the FBI.
Yeah, for those who don't know, yeah, Fred Hampton, and see, we talk about the impact of the African American. Fred Hampton was 21-year-old law student, brilliant, highly articulate, and at that young age, he knew so much about world politics. One would say, how does this guy, from the inner cities of Chicago, how does he know all this stuff? He knew about what was going on in China. He read about Mao. He was brilliant. And so he was the one bringing the gang members together. So actually, Fred Hampton was murdered by Chicago police and the FBI. They got a guy to infiltrate O'Neill. O'Neill became a spy. He had some charges, and the way that he could get out of prison was to infiltrate the Black Panthers. So he, when one night he had gotten close to Fred Hampton, they would always have meetings, so they would cook dinner. He put some barbiturates in his drink. Fred Hampton fell asleep. The task team came in 2, 3, 4 in the morning, knocked the door down and shot. They shot the place up. His wife was pregnant with the son that is still living now, that's an activist, Fred Hampton Jr. Shot the place up, killed one guy at the door, Mark Clark. But Fred Hampton was actually still alive. But to show you how much he was villainized because of his brilliance, he was bringing gang members together to vote. They were starting to build, get involved in politics. They heard, they had rounded up everybody that was in the house. They could hear the cops in the back saying, "Is that Fred Hampton? He's still alive." You could hear, bam, bam. He's dead now. They shot him in the head. So his family sued. I think they got like $1 million. But these are some of the trauma that went to these groups. It's why the 60s was so turbulent. And so the Black Panthers were always, like in a matter of a few months in the late 60s, like 36 Panthers were killed. I mean, they had factions in New York, Chicago, LA, and most cities, and they were doing good things. They, they had, like I said, free breakfast. They were feeding children, and some of the programs that exist now, food stamps and stuff, came from the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton was one of the most charismatic names. He was the one who coined the Rainbow Coalition. As Jesse Jackson ran off, that came from Fred Hampton. 21-year-old law student, Fred Hampton. So these are some of the impacts on the landscape. I mean, like I said, it's such a gargantuan task. You could miss some of the nooks and crannies because there were so many organizations, and there were white organizations that aligned with the Panthers. And then you had some friction because you had some Panthers that were totally black power, and Huey Newton was thinking more on a national, global level. But I don't know if we had a picture of Stokely Carmichael in here, but he was more on the black power side. And then you had he authored a book. Matter of fact, Stokely Carmichael marched with Dr. King. He was one of the more revolutionary minds in the marching struggle. He started out with SNCC, the Southern Leadership Group, and Southern Christian, National Christian Leadership Group. he was just so revolutionary. That's why he became a Panther. But you know, to fill in the gaps from 1900 on up even to present day, like I said, it's just an ocean of information, and one has to think, like, what stands out to me is just the change in the psychodynamic thinking of the African from the early 1900s, from more of a servile, you know, assimilating in society, not causing any trouble, to now you're getting educated, you're thinking more on a global level, a Pan-Africanist mindset, and a do for self. And as Professor Dr. John Henrik Clarke would say, why should you compromise your authenticities? And so these were some of the things, and to counter the myths of black inferiority. So the 60s brought out some incredible things. Trying to see is any noteworthy things. Then you had black ownership. Another gentleman authored a book during that time. We talked about the cities and the Great Migrations. Herb Boyd, Black Detroit. Detroit was another city that had a prolific input of black population. At one point, home ownership by blacks was 70% in Detroit. Of course, they had the cars. And the thing is, when you have jobs and housing, that's the biggest thing. And I think that those cities that provided that is where blacks really were able to celebrate coming from the South and having those essentials. Yes, ma'am, please.
The PBS right now at 9 o'clock has a series about the Black migration. As a matter of one of the programs is on at 9 o'clock tonight.
Yeah, and I bet they have to mention Isabel Wilkerson. Her book was a bestseller, and that migration, it changed the whole landscape of the country. I mean, we're talking about 6 million, and of course that created a lot of friction too, because now you have all of these black bodies coming into cities, occupying jobs that whites that were already in those cities kind of rejected. So you did have a lot of issues, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, the bigger cities. And so that Great Migration was really the catapult of the 20th century. Let me see if there's any other. Please, anybody want to add anything to this? Yes, sir.
I don't want to take anything away from Duke Ellington. But one individual that doesn't get any credit, or at least not enough credit, is Billy Strayhorn, who did a lot of the work in that type of music. And I feel it's sad that, Duke Ellington, not sad, but Duke Ellington gets all the credit and no one knows about Billy Strayhorn.
Billy Strayhorn was Duke's alter ego, and he did the writing. He composed Take the A Train, Caravan, yes, good point. These are the points we want to bring up. Billy Strayhorn, Duke Ellington, I'm glad you brought that. Duke Ellington kind of protected Billy Strayhorn because in the jazz world, Billy Strayhorn was gay. And during that time, we talking 50s, 60s, it was taboo in the black communities. It hadn't made its way to mainstream lips, so to speak. And I'm glad you brought up Billy Strayhorn because he was a genius. He was a genius. He did write a lot of his compositions, and Duke got the credit. Good one. Anybody else bring up anything? We're having a discussion. I'm not just
So, the title of this talk is The Impact of African Americans on Performing Arts and
Sports and
Performing Arts. And I just want to put out there that the Historical Society does these first Wednesday luncheons, and a couple of luncheons ago we had a speaker on American music. And most of us who were present that day concluded at the end of the discussion that American music is black music, plain and simple. And it started with the spiritual.
Yeah.
But when you look at then you graduate into jazz and then the introduction of the Afro-Cuban stuff or the Afro-Latino. At the end of the day, that's American music.
Well, a lot of the rock and roll stars got their themes in rock and roll from the incubation of the blues. Big Mama Thornton did Hound Dog before Elvis. Elvis made it big. And Willie Dixon wrote a lot of those. He was a bass player, but he wrote, and Chess Records is really in Chicago. That was where it was a prolific amount of blues guys that came out of there. Little Walter, Muddy Waters, these are giants, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry. All of these came out of there. And there's one story I read, but a lot of the rock and roll musicians, here's a story of paying homage to the Delta blues giants. There was a couple of John Lennon, the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, a bunch of those guys got together, flew down to the Delta, and a few of them paid for tombstones for some of these fallen heroes. And I read a story, they got in a limo, they trudged through mud and grass to go in the back down in Louisiana to go visit these graves. So here you got these multi-millionaire rock stars getting muddy, dirty feet to go pay homage to these graves. So this tells you the story of jazz and blues and what an impact. You know, John Lennon, how Mick Jagger, Rolling Stones, how much bigger can you get? You know, trudging through mud and getting grass stains, going to see Muddy Waters. Yeah,
So,
please.
you know, more recently, you know, Rhiannon Giddens came out with her music, really influential on Beyonce, who came up with this cowboy album. And that banjo was an African instrument to begin with. And so it even goes deeper into Appalachia and all these other places where these African roots are now being acknowledged in real time. So.
Good point. I think it's so innate and visceral that some of them are stumbling on it by accident. Because it's, you know, I mean, Beyonce may have never heard of Muddy Waters. She may have, but or you know, well, she's from Texas, so we got to give her a little. We got to give her a little due. But the heavyweights. But I think it's instinctual because it came, you know, started with the drums because the Africans use it to communicate, and so we can go back thousands of years and it's still, you know, relevant today. But please ask a barrage of questions.
Can you just touch and just speak a little on Quincy?
Okay. Well, I know why she's saying that, you guys. One thing I haven't mentioned, well, we've all heard of the great Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday was from Baltimore, and she was one of the greatest jazz singers of all time. And the only reason Dr. Manning is saying that, because I shared with her, my grandfather, my namesake, Bobby Tucker, was her pianist from 1942 to 1949. But I wasn't gonna go into family stuff up here. But it's an impact on the entertainment business. My grandfather was kind of a celebrity, Bobby Tucker. He was an accompanist and an arranger, and he was also a pallbearer at Billie Holiday's funeral. And something I wasn't going to say, but she's got me on a roll. Billie Holiday, if you're familiar with her story, she was a pretty bad drug addict. But her voice was hauntingly beautiful. If you're familiar with her, so I mean she's one of the giants in all of music. And so my grandfather, she got close with our family, and when she would go in these drug rehabs and stuff, she would actually stay with my family in Morristown back in the 40s. So we have some family ties with Billie Holiday. I shared that with Dr. Manning and showed her some pictures and stuff. So then after that, my grandfather played 40 years with Billy Eckstine. Isn't it? People figure he was a great singer, Billy Eckstine. I got to meet Billy Eckstine. I know his kids and stuff. And my grandfather had an association with Quincy Jones. They became good friends. Quincy was a trumpet player originally back in the 40s. Of course, he went on to become one of the greatest band leaders and composers of all time. We just lost Quincy recently. But Quincy and my grandfather became best friends. And Quincy was a 14-year-old trumpet player. If you ever see the movie Ray, Quincy was played by Lorenz Tate. He's 14-year-old trumpet. So he couldn't get in the clubs. And my grandfather was the composer for Billie Holiday in '49. And Quincy, my grandfather hired that horn section, and he got Quincy in the club to do work. He's like, let the kid in. He's gonna be with the horn section. So Quincy was forever indebted. Not saying my grandfather got Quincy started, but they also collaborated on a lot of things over the years. There's a movie out you may have heard called The Wiz with Michael Jackson, Diana Ross was in that, an all-star cast, Richard Pryor, 1978. My grandfather and Quincy did the musical arrangements for that. It's called The Wiz. It's a black version of The Wizard of Oz. So they did that. I had the good fortune to meet Diana Ross. Even though she's a diva, she was nice to me. He also did some arrangements for Tony Bennett. I never got to meet Anthony Benedetto before, but he's done that. But now, even though I'm talking about my grandfather, we're still on the impact of entertainment. Yeah, so that thank you, Dr. Mann, for extending that thing. But, oh yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Hey, good evening. I just want to say first and foremost, I love this topic. Thank you for your presentation. 5 years ago, I did a presentation about athletes and activism, and I saw in the bio, or just the brief blurb about what your presentation was on. One person I presented that I don't know if you may know of or heard of, or folks in the room may know of. He was known as the Jackie Robinson of hockey. His name is Willie O'Ree. He's Canadian though, but the story is that his grandparents migrated to Canada by way of the U.S. through the Underground Railroad. But yeah, in my presentation, which feels like a lifetime ago, I was combining social advocacy and policy and sports, and yeah, I mentioned half the athletes you mentioned in your bio, but one of them. I don't know if Willie O'Ree comes to mind, but yeah, something, you know, that folks like hockey or...
It doesn't, but they just inducted the first black hockey player in the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Oh, no way.
I don't remember his name, but there was a
Is it
doctor.
Grant Fuhr?
I don't remember his name, but they're
The name's gonna
black,
hit me any minute.
they were blacks in hockey.
Mhm.
Yeah, you know, one thing too, speaking of revolutionary thought, it made me think of you guys familiar with John Carlos and Tommy Smith? The 1968 Olympics, they won the medals. They put the black gloves on. They got pictures of that. They got their medals taken, but I think they reinstituted. But these were just some of the mindsets and the pushbacks that blacks were given during those times. They wanted to be heard, their voices. Well, please. Because remember, this is a back and forth discussion.
You talked about sports and music, but you didn't touch upon the theater arts at all. And like Lena Horne, who first started, and you know others that came out, Hattie McDaniel.
Yes.
Is there anything you want to add to them as far as breaking the ranks in the theater?
Well, yes. Hattie McDaniel said something very interesting when she won her the Golden Globe, the Oscar. And of course she couldn't come out. She had to sit, you know, apart from everything. But when she spoke, she said, I'll make sure I'm a credit to my race. And that's kind of painful to hear that. because you won because you were great. But I mean, I guess I don't want to say painful. I take that back. But you want to. There's a thing in sports where they say, "Act like you've been here." I am a published author, and I have a book called "Black Excellence is a Norm," and I based it on the ideologies of the great psychologist Dr. Amos Wilson. There's a teacher, Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, and it's normalizing black excellence. Because in today's society, we're around a lot of kids. A lot of kids want to be an NBA player or, football player. But what I did was I profiled 20 black professionals. I got a gentleman, helped revolutionize robotic surgery. We got black engineers, black architects. So I got their perspective, and I put it in a book, not biographical, but just their journey, how they had to go the extra mile. One business owner said how he had to do the longer hours, and he made a good point. He said, as a black business owner, and you have a white clientele, they're with you because you're good, not because you're black. But he did make a point where you may not get that second chance if you don't perform the first time. So these were some of the conscious level things that the black business owners had to face. So that's where the Brother Rob came from. I used that title because just Rob was boring. So I had to put a little celebrity to the author's name. And so black excellence is a norm. And it goes along the lines of what we're talking about, the impact. It has to be normal, psychologically, not just when something happens, we say, oh, wow, this person did this. It has to be the norm. We've had a lot of firsts. Lenny Wilkens was one of the first black coaches in the NBA. He had become the winningest coach in the NBA. I think his record has been surpassed, but it regardless of the start coming, out of slavery, the Great Migrations, it has to be normalized. But please.
What can you tell us about Paul Robeson, who was in Westfield as an athlete and as in performing arts?
And see, these are good points because, like I told Jerry when I started, this is such a gargantuan thing. It's hard to, you can forget some of the giants talking about giants. And of course, we know Paul Robeson, New Jersey guy, Somerville, went to Princeton. Yeah. Yeah. But all-American in football, just incredible guy. Then, of course, went on to be outspoken. And they because he shared on, Russia. And you mentioned that back then, and then you're being investigated. And actually, he passed away kind of without money, kind of despondent, but a great man like him. So these are, you have this impact, but it comes at you, alternatively when you speak up, But yeah, Paul Robeson, another giant. How can we, the art right there. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you were going to come a little bit more to the present day and talk about, because as I go back to the title of the talk, the impact of African Americans, and people who kind of changed the game, like Serena and Venus, they changed the game.
Yeah.
Some of the black quarterbacks. So, black people have had serious impact in these areas.
No, tremendous. Whenever I think of Venus and Serena, not way before the movie came out, King Richard, I gave a lot of the credit to the father, Richard Williams, and he kept them girls safe. They grew up in Compton, where tennis is not played, and he raised them to be champions. There was no other plan. It had to happen. They had to be world champions. So when I think of Venus and Serena, and I do, and they did revolutionize tennis because they came out with the braids and the beads. And at one point they were complaining about about that. But they, just incredible, not, like I said, not only tennis players, but trailblazers. And it took them a while to garner the respect, because even Serena, even in her greatness in her years, she still felt that, judges were giving her a tough time and things, yeah.
I don't want to make too much of an issue about
No,
this,
please,
but I think it's really nice now that a black athlete can just be a quarterback and not a black quarterback. It's I know there's still ways to come, but it's a.
And that goes along the phrase countering the myths of black inferiority. And Warren Moon, a black quarterback, he's still in the top 5 of all time yards thrown. We're touching upon the cerebral aspects of sport, and they just, but we're talking about owners that were just out of touch. I guess you think of, it's sort of synonymous with the plantation, the athletes. There's also a book called $40 Million Slave. I forget the gentleman's name, but it's not too long ago. And he speaks about this, how a lot of the black athletes are a product. And but getting back to the quarterback issue, it took a while, because a lot of them, because they were such gifted athletes, they didn't include like I said, the intellect. They were just runners, or they would even change your position if you were a good black quarterback in college. They would make you a wide receiver, but some of the black quarterbacks, and it really damaged some of them psychologically. James Harris was one of the first black quarterbacks, played for the Rams. He was just as good as anybody in the league, but he wasn't treated fairly, and he had years of depression and things. So we don't read about or hear about how some of them are affected in their lonely times. Jefferson, they called him Jefferson Street Joe. Joe Gilliam was a black quarterback for the Steelers in the late 60s, early 70s. He was doing really good, and he got pushed out. Terry Bradshaw, who's a big name, came out. But he became an alcoholic and was like darn near homeless. So these things do affect them times in their lonely times. We see them on TV producing, but then when the lights go out, it's a different thing. Yeah, just anybody want to bring up anything? Because, like I said, it's easy to forget, because you're bringing up these giants. Let me see anything in conclusion, and then if there's any other the impact. It's one quote out in a gentleman, Carlos Crooks, says, "The culture of a people is best manifested by the homage they pay to those who led with dedication and devotion to freedom and cause." So that's the culmination of these greats we speak of.
Thank you, Rob. A great conversation to be had. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you to all who made this program a success. Our next session will be on Tuesday, February 18th. Our speaker will be Ethel M. Washington. Rebecca Williams, okay? Rebecca Williams here at the library, same time, same place. So just come on out, continue to share and tell others, and bring a friend with you. Thank you once again for coming out tonight. Be home safe, everyone.